Okay. Anyways, if there was one thing you could remove from the world, what would it be? Well, again, that's the sort of question that I'm going to need an answer to once you reach the end of the video. And my answer is also going to be that too. But the whole thing is like, look, every single time there's been a whole bunch of new Trini recordings that I've been watching. So first I started off with Trini versus Seth, the classic. And then I was like, okay, yeah, Trini, Loki, he did good in that debate. They were relative, da 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 da. I think Seth won like kind of mid-diff, but hey, who knows? But the whole point isn't really to talk about Trini, it's to talk about like the old community, really. It's like, in the past, the sort of focus that people had whenever they were debating was completely different than the type of focus that they have now. Typically, people when they debate now, the sort of focus that they have is on the argumentative quality there, right? And even though argumentation is kind of arbitrary, like in terms of, oh well, who's a better arguer, right? The sort of foundations you have in the arguments you're making are going to be the groundworks, and they also play a heavy factor into the arguments you're giving. So, for example, you'll notice, and people have said this themselves, that if you're defending a position that is just straightforwardly wrong, that's contradicted by all of the literature, you have a higher chance of being, argumentatively inferior than somebody who isn't doing that, whose arguments are actually backed up by the literature. So that's why whenever, for example, I see somebody saying really silly stuff, so for example, it'd be Trini saying something like, epistemic possibility is doubting everything. Now, I think he means epistemic skepticism, but if you're talking about modalities, then there's no reason to make that sort of mistake. He said epistemology was, oh no, he said specifically epistemic possibility was just you doubting everything, da 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 da. And it's like, look, okay, it's like, if it's fine, if it's one blunder, and I don't see it again. But then there's also just misrepresenting what more realism is at the start of his very debate with Noodles. And the debate he was having with Noodles was on meta ethics. He was trying to defend more realism. Noodles was defending like subjectivism. And then Trini said and outlined his position as the view that there are moral facts. Now, I don't know whether or not he takes something to be a fact if and only if it's mind independent, because then it would be like, okay, well, it's a fact that I'm thinking of what I'm about to say next. However, that fact is entirely dependent on my mental states, right? And it's entirely dependent on multiple mental states that I have. So obviously, there can be facts that do exist that are entirely mind dependent. So whenever people try and give these excuses of, oh well, Trini isn't wrong, it's like, oh well, he's obviously wrong. But then sort of the excuse is trying to kind of move to, oh yeah, well, even though he's blatantly wrong, he argued it well. And it's like, well, obviously, if the sort of view that he was giving and the sort of like positions he was saying, well, something that he argued properly, there'd be no reason everyone disagreed with him. There'd be no reason why everyone just thinks different things than him. So, for example, whenever he says more realism is the view that they're objective, more facts, it's like, well, obviously that's just false, right? That isn't like even sure that is a necessary, or like, oh no, specifically was that more realism is just the view that there are more facts. It's like, yeah, that's one of the conditions for more realism. It has to be propositional in the first place, right? Meaning that there has to be a fact of the matter, and the fact of the matter also has to be mind independent. So whenever he just names one of the necessary conditions, right? Oh no, and it's a necessary condition, but it isn't even sufficient. And it's like, okay, yeah, why are you making all of these entry-level blunders? It's like 6 steps into the debate with Noodles. And then it goes into this whole big other separate debate. And this whole separate debate just goes into the lines of, oh, well, is what he's saying really bad if he can defend it really well? And again, I touched on this before, but it's like, okay, well, look, you wouldn't be defending it as, oh, people wouldn't be clowning him for saying if the argument he was giving was so solid, because obviously people don't clown other people for saying things that they have extremely solid defenses of. In fact, people are more inclined to believe things, right, if there's really solid defenses of them. So whenever Trini just starts talking and then just starts saying all of this like extremely proprietary stuff down backed up in the literature, it's like, yeah, I would be convinced by what he was saying if what he was saying was actually coherent and backed up in the literature. So take infinity, for example, right? Infinity thinks that existence is a predicate, and he thinks that there are infinite amount of predicates that objects have, right? And then it's like, in the past, people were convinced by that. So even if what he was saying was just not backed up by the literature at all, people were convinced, and people thought that, oh yeah, what he was saying had no real problem with it. And they even started taking his position as well, simply because of the fact that he had quote-unquote decent arguments for it. Or at least that was what they thought in the past, right? Or whenever he said atemporal causation was impossible, it's like, okay, well, people were convinced of that simply because of the fact that they thought the sorts of things that he was saying, they had such good arguments for it, that even if he were flat out blatantly wrong, that they would still be convinced by his position anyway. So now it just begs the question of, okay, well, what's the real difference between Infinity and Trinity there, where everyone is, even though they point out, they agree that both of these guys are saying stuff wrong, right? However, currently, people who typically look into, and I hope everyone can agree with this as well, that people, as debating has continued from like the point of COVID to now, people have started looking into philosophy a lot more, right, compared to what they did in the past. So I've had somebody like Tigger, for example, in an applied ethics debate he had with me, say, oh, well, I'm not going to use the philosophical term because I'm not a philosopher. Keep in mind, this was in a debate about ethics, which is a branch of philosophy. So it's like all of these, really stupid points that people make, and they think that, oh well, if I just cover it up with theatrics and I just yell at the other person and I loudmic them, then the entire audience will be convinced. And it's like, okay, well, that's obviously not true. It seems as if people have started to like sway from being convinced merely by theatrics and being convinced merely by who's screaming louder than who, because I've seen Tigger say this personally himself. Tigger said something like, oh my god, well, if you just start yelling at the other person, I might just say you win up of rhetoric. So again, the other thing is, I don't really understand this concept, right? Maybe it's because like in this specific server that I just joined, it seems as if all of the low tier debaters have congregated to start like sharing their own little hive mind on some Infinity Syndicate type thing, right, with Midnight at the top. But it's really fine. It's like I've seen people try and say that, oh well, just merely tone of voice. At least this is how I think other people define rhetoric. Just tone of voice, or how convincing you are. And then simply saying how convincing you are is a bit vague and is a bit broad, because of the fact that, again, people are convinced by way different things. And it's a topic that I keep talking about in all of my videos. Like, people are convinced by different things. So again, it's like, would you rather be convinced by or would you rather have your beliefs influenced by people who just simply, if they speak loud enough and if they speak in a certain way, right? Would you rather have your beliefs swayed by them, or would you rather have your beliefs swayed by somebody who has a strong foundation and strong arguments for the view that he's trying to convince you of? And it's like, well, if you choose the latter, then obviously you're more likely to have more true beliefs than false beliefs, which is typically in everyone's interest, unless you like being delusional. But then it's like, to each their own, right? That you are more likely to like accept the latter because of the fact that if they have strong arguments for their view, and those strong arguments are the sort of foundation that you have for your view, or you have for determining, like, what's it called, whether or not he won or lost the debate. Right? If you are just convinced by his arguments, you're more likely to have good, like, true beliefs, because again, if he has strong evidence, he has strong justification, then obviously the proposition he's defending is going to be more likely, at least in context to the amount of knowledge that you have, right, of the topic, or the amount of, like, just the amount of things you know. But yeah, another thing I've noticed from like watching quote unquote old gen debate recordings is just the fact that typically they have a very strong misunderstanding of what the word objective means. Now, again, maybe in the layman's sense that whenever people talk about objective, what they mean is just that it's aligned with the facts, right? And it's like, okay, well, that's fine. It's like if I say I'm being objective, it's like I'm trying to remove my own personal opinions from it. And that kind of has some sort of implications of what like the philosophical term actually means, which is like you simply just being mind independent. So for example, again, I've had people tell me that, oh well, if something is objective, then it would never change, and this person again is just Tigger, right? So again, it's like this is the sort of response that you should give if you hear any like mistaken individual be like, oh my god, well, if something's objective, how can they change? It's like, okay, well, look, rocks, they exist mind independently, so they exist like external to your mind. Yeah, obviously, if lightning hits the rock and the rock shatters into a million pieces, obviously the rock is going to change, right? However, it's still mind dependent. Like, the rock's existence is no longer mind dependent simply just because it can change. Or you can imagine somebody who has their own mental states, right? And for example, take God or something, right? God's mind never changes, right? So again, even though the sort of thoughts that God has are mind dependent, because of course you can't think without a mind, right? Even though it's mind dependent, his like mind cell, is like mental states will still never change. However, you wouldn't say that God's mental states are objective, right? That wouldn't make any sense. That would align with how any philosopher used the terms, right? But again, typically it's like people seem to the sort of debate culture and the sort of ideologies around debating, they should really need to shift towards something else, right? They need to shift towards, more argumentative focused debates, because it's like, I know I had that one debate with Jam where I was yelling at him, and it's like, yeah, in the moment it was funny, in the moment it was hilarious actually, but looking at the recording back, it's like, yeah, okay, I won and all, right? But the sort of responses I gave, I could have like shot his argument down really quickly if I was just, not as angry at the guy. And I can't even remember why I was angry at him. And it's like, getting angry really quickly should actually just be a genuine sign of having low intelligence, right? So that's why, like, you need, sort of need to limit the amount of times you get angry, or like, for example, whenever people like to call it like ignorance or something, it's like, okay, I don't know why that term exists in the first place, but it's like, yeah, so you basically, you just act quote unquote really black. I think that's what people online call it. Say it's like act really black and act really ignorant and don't listen to any of the counter arguments. Just keep making your arguments. Like, that isn't the sort of debate that you want to get into. So for example, it's like, oh, the people who think, oh my god, if I just overtalk my opponent, I'll win. It's like, okay, well, what happens when the other person, they don't even need to loud mic, they just have a louder mic than you. So every time both of you speak, he's the only person being heard, you aren't being heard at all. And it's like, okay, cool, you've said what you had to say, you decided not to take turns, but who's that really benefited, right? Because nobody heard you, but everyone heard the other person, right? So it's like, you really gain no sort of benefit from, just crashing out and being completely uneducated. But yeah, it's like, another thing is, a main reason why the community is dying is because of the fact that, like, people have decided that, oh wow, it's corny to actually be good at debating or something. And it's like, okay, well, maybe you can say it's corny, right? But the only sort of a time and place where you'd actually be able to confidently say it's corny is if you don't use Discord at all, right? And again, if you are on Discord and if you look at what the type of things that these people who say debating is corny do, well, they either a loud mic, right, which means quite literally that they buy it, because again, loud mics don't work with every mic, so you're constantly buying a new and improved mic, right? Or you're spending loads of money on a Blue Yeti which you barely use, right? Because again, you have other things you need to do, and the only reason why you use a Blue Yeti in the first place is because you want a loud mic. So you spend money on a Blue Yeti, right? And then after spending money on a Blue Yeti, you then go, you try and find the best sets, right? You spend time creating your own sets, and it's like, immediately after you're done going China, it's like, well, there's nothing really interesting. It's like, people be in chat and be like, Lamau, haha, they'll give you subs, alright? But it's like, none of them are actually laughing because you aren't really saying anything funny there, right? Or take joke, for example. I know sometimes people like, you're telling me you spend your time honing your craft and the ability to insult somebody else, and the type of knowledge that you gain from being able to, like, I don't know, being able to do joke for joke with somebody else. It's like, unless you're going into battle rapping like Chrome or something, then you aren't really going to get much benefit from it, right? Whereas if you go into, like, for example, debating or something, at least you can learn some, like, at least you can learn something. At least if it isn't fiction, you can learn something, right? And these type of things that you learn whenever you're talking about philosophy can change the way you look at things in general, right? Take, for example, like, people who decide, oh well, what's it called, I need to decide whether or not God exists. That's one of the biggest and most relevant debates, and it changes the way people looks at life in general, right? And it's like, okay, well, you aren't really going to get those types of knowledge from doing all of these other facets of, like, other things people do on Discord. And the other thing is, like, the only other types of people who I see calling debates corny are the extorters, right? And it's like, dude, really, like, I know one of them is called, literally, it's called the CP files, right? Where he just sits there, and I don't even know what he does in his spare time. But again, you can tell from the first two letters in his name, that guy obviously isn't a good person, right? And yeah, I kind of pulled the prank on him. I got him to what's it called? I got him to admit and, like, prove to the VC that he had CP, and then I immediately banned him from all of the servers we shared. But yeah, that's literally it. There's not really much else to say. Aside from the fact that I'd rather much prefer that if people who, whenever they started debating again, they had much more ambition than they did in the past. Because again, ambition is one of the main things that allows you to be good at debating, right? It's like, obviously, if you're going to do a hobby, and really, this is why most Discord users won't actually show the amount of screen time that they have on the app, right? And the reason why is because it's kind of shameful, right? They are kind of ashamed that, oh wow, I spend this much time on the app. And then if you look, well, what are you spending the time on the app doing, right? Let's not shame each other for like spending time on the app, right? It's cool to each their own, right? You don't know somebody's situation. Maybe they don't have any friends. Who knows? Like, people could be on the app for like loads of reasons, right? But it's like, okay, well, what are you doing on the app? Okay, you're arguing with people in text chat about lookism, right, for 11 hours. And it's like, okay, well, wouldn't it be way more productive to have a 20-30 minute conversation with them in VC, and then from realizing, okay, well, having actual productive debates where you don't yell at each other for 30 minutes, this kind of thing seems kind of interesting, right? And after noticing that, oh yeah, this is kind of interesting, right, then you start and you move on, and because and then obviously everyone's going to lose at least once, so you learn the feeling of losing, and you're like, I don't like that feeling, right? And then you just have ambition, and it's like, that's the type of thing where everyone needs to have. That's why, like, you notice that whenever I see people debating and they're really bad, it's like, I'll be the first one to say, hey, you're really bad, because obviously that's supposed to be the type of thing that motivates you to improve, rather than like this current debate culture where it's like, if somebody calls you bad, your first motivation is to go and debate them, and even if you lose and they call you bad again, you try and keep trying to debate them, but then you never really like and this is something that I haven't seen loads of debaters do. You never really watch debates and self-reflect. You only watch debates to determine if you won or not, right? So like, whenever, for example, you notice that I don't know, take a debater like Smoothie or Mono, for example, right? It's like, I've told Mono the type of thing that he needs to improve, and it's just like, you notice him debating, it's like, yeah, in the moment it seems great, it seems cool, he seems funny, right? When he's just yelling at his opponent, calling them like slurs, sex swearing at them, right? And then you notice that, okay, well, whenever he actually just isn't swearing at his opponent, you notice he immediately loses, right? And even in the debates where he loses really badly and it's only substance and he doesn't get the opportunity to yell at the other person, right? And it's like, you notice he never really takes a moment to watch the debate, reflect on the sort of stuff he was saying, reflect on the sort of arguments that his opponent used, and how he could better respond to them. Because obviously it's one thing to respond to arguments in the midst of the debate, and it's another thing to respond to arguments or learn how to better respond to arguments after the debate. It's like, people take for granted your ability to prepare for debates, right? It's like, you can prepare, you can make yourself look better, right? You don't need to, and this is something that I don't know why people like doing, you don't need to like have this image as a spur. You don't need to have this image as like, oh yeah, haha, I'm going to yell at this other person, I'm going to overtalk them, I'm going to cut them off, right? I'm going to swear at them, I'm going to curse them out, right? You don't need to do that, right? You don't need to do that to look cool. Yeah, I'm sure most people, like in real life too, they are way more impressed by somebody who, even if they say a little, there's a lot of meaning in the sort of things that they say, rather than somebody who just sits there, tries to be as loud as possible, tries to swear as much as possible, and tries to feed into as many negative stereotypes about people specifically. And I notice a lot of this time that most of the debaters on Code are black people, right? And then you notice that the sort of higher tier debaters that you see on their tier list, if you notice, aside from like KC, me, I don't even know if Gizbob's white. Who else? Apollo, Julian. It's like, there's a very low percentage of people who actually make it very far, or make it even become semi-notable or semi-like decent in terms of debating, who are like black compared to the amount of people who are white. Like, immediately you notice how I struggled whenever I was trying to name people who are black who are that high, and then immediately if it's somebody who's white, it's like Eric, Center, Trini, Trini, really, but like Trini, all of the, I mean Trini included as well. It's like, this is someone, and it's like, yeah, sure, I don't think he's good, right? But it's like, you notice that everyone back then also thought he was good. Trini, Seth, Noodles, Draco. You notice how none of them were black, right? and then all of the other competition that they were facing, they never made it as far as them, right? So you notice that it's the sort of, and especially by feeding into the sort, and like you can say Ariel was considered to be good, but he was considered to be good for all of the most stupid reasons. At least all of the people who I named, right, from the old community who were considered good, they at least had some substance, except for Noodles. Noodles is really stupid, right? But it's like, um why, like, what's the sort of reason why all of these other guys, you notice that they aren't yelling as much, they aren't like spurging out, they aren't rogging out, as Sonic likes to say, right? However, you, like, what's the real distinction between like you and all of those other people? Like, you notice, like, and I know this is like, I know I've watched K's debates. K doesn't really seem to get really angry, or he doesn't seem to yell. He doesn't yell at all, actually, right? And it's like he's more so substance based than any of the other debaters. So it's just like, really, why do, and especially it happens a lot of the time with like lower tier debaters, it's like, why do you feel the need to feed into all of the stereotypes about people, like black people being loud, being vulgar? It's like, do you never enjoy actually outsmarting your opponent rather than just out yelling them? And it's like, I'm sure obviously there's always going to, or obviously I should say, there's obviously going to be continuously advancing software that allows you to increase your mic to 2 billion decibels, where immediately you turn on your loud mic, your opponent goes deaf, they start bleeding, your mic is as loud as a whale's, you're using a supercomputer to be able to loud mic with such efficiency that the amount of time that it takes you to open equalizer APO is 0.2 heptoseconds, right? And it's like, yeah, sure, maybe in future that sort of technology will come out. However, you like, there's always going to be better technology that's coming out, right? And you'll notice that you're just going to be, you keep piling on more and more money. Like, immediately the Blue Yeti stops being as dominant, or immediately a better mic comes out than the Blue Yeti, all of the land micers, and that mic that comes out after the Blue Yeti, immediately it comes out, you notice that, oh my god, this mic actually has a louder bass mic than most Blue Yeti loud micers. And then immediately half of the community has spent half of their life savings, right, to come on and then buy it, right? And you notice that, and I'm sure the people who are at Amazon are also thinking, well, why all of these people suddenly buying Blue Yetis? What are they using it for? And if they conducted a survey where you could not lie, right, the sort of what's it called, the sort of things that people would say that they were doing is, oh yeah, how's loud micing on Discord? And it's like, really, is that how you want to spend your life? Do you really, like, after, if your parents came in and asked you for a recording of all of the stuff you've done ever since you've been on Discord, right, say all of your interactions on Discord are all recorded, you're going to tell me that there isn't at least one substantive thing that you've said that your parents could say, that's kind of smart? But no, all they will be able to hear is just you loud micing on Discord. It's like, hey, but that's it from me. If you want to know the thing that I'd remove from the world or I'd ban from the world, it's just lying in court, bro. Perjury. Come on now. Intelligent, politically correct answer. You know what I mean. Or police brutality. But hey, this has been Shinra, and I'm out.